So anybody can go next, or I can choose somebody. Eeny, meeny, miny. Okay, Jesse, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, man. Happily. So thanks for having me. Thanks for everybody who invited me. I am associate editor over at The Voice of San Diego. I've been a journalist for about 11 years now. Grew up in Chicago. I lived in New York. I did some reporting in Oregon as well as in Minnesota, where I initially got started on surveillance coverage as a journalist, covering the state house there and reading through different proposals, which would have changed the definition of how law enforcement could collect data on its own citizens, which was about 5-6 years ago, initially got me thinking about this. But it wasn't really until I moved to San Diego that I took on the topic of surveillance as a beat. And that's in part because San Diego's on the border. There's a military culture here. There are a lot of different law enforcement agencies overlapping with one another and collaborating with one another, which means there's just a maze of bureaucracy that you have to deal with and have to cipher through in order to understand what's going on, because oftentimes you'll find that the surveillance devices which one department might use were actually purchased by another and were essentially loaned out. So I picked up the surveillance beat while I was in San Diego, partly because I was interested in the topic and its ramifications for civil liberties and civil rights, but more importantly, because I felt an obligation to it because it's so prevalent here. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of the examples to come over the next hour and a half, but there's no shortage of them in San Diego, various projects that have been rolled out without any oversight or without any consent. And so we'll look forward to the discussion, and thanks for having me.
And Albert.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with so many friends who I've worked with virtually in the past. And my name is Albert Fox Cahn. I'm the founder and executive director of STOP, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, a New York-based privacy and civil rights group that is committed to dismantling systems of mass surveillance, particularly those at the state and local level. And I came to this work because of, well, it really goes back to when I was a 12-year-old in Rudy Giuliani's New York, beginning a lifetime of activism by standing up to police brutality and police violence and police murders that so defined the NYPD of that time and that every time basically throughout our history as a city. And I was also a giant computer nerd, and I also went off to law school. And after deciding that corporate law was not a good fit for me, I ended up making the switch to public interest law. And I actually went to the New York chapter of CARE, where I was their first ever lawyer. I was their only full-time employee when I started. And, I thought it would be a very comfortable 9-to-5 job, and that there wasn't going to be that much to keep us busy once Hillary won. And instead, we were dealing with this inflection point of Islamophobia, unlike anything I could have imagined. And in the months that followed, with the incredible work with my colleagues at CARE all across the country and responding to the Muslim ban, to responding to hate crimes, I saw that there was we had the same debate at the federal level since I was in high school about surveillance. We hadn't really changed much, but at the state and local level, we had really redefined the ways that these technologies were defining the powers of the state to track, to incarcerate, to really invade the most intimate spaces we have. And so that's what inspired me to create STOP. And since then, we've done everything from writing new city and state laws, advocating passage, doing hundreds of events and educational workshops, and really trying to bring together this idea that surveillance is never one size fits all. When we're talking about the harms of surveillance, it's one size fits none, because it's all about the existing power dynamics that have defined our white supremacist police states since the founding of this country. And the technology exacerbates that, but it doesn't remake that. But very much looking forward to this broader conversation.
Awesome. Oh boy, I was unmuting myself, but I was already unmuted. Hamaira, last but certainly not least.
Thanks, Khaled. So my name is Hamaira Yousafi. I'm the interim executive director for the Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans, better known as PANA. We are a community organizing and public policy hub, and we work directly with the refugee community as well as the broader Black immigrant and MEMSA community, that being Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian community. We're all about, folks owning their own power to bring about social change locally, statewide, and nationally. So we do that through civic engagement work, through political education and community building. But we also do a lot of policy advocacy work. So we focus on immigrant rights issues as well as surveillance issues. So to the question of like, what brings me into this work? It's really about my community, right? Our community, especially post September 11th, has really faced the brunt of surveillance issues, as well as other minority communities throughout the country. This word called terrorist has been used against Black and Muslims as an excuse to surveil us, to criminalize us, and to deport us. Here in San Diego, our organization, and actually several of the organizations who put this event together tonight worked together in response to the fact that there was street light cameras that were being installed all throughout San Diego that had surveillance nodes on them, right? And recognizing the surveillance implications that had, the privacy implications that had on our communities. We got together with about 30 plus other organizations to say, we need to change around this. There needs to be transparency. There needs to be accountability and other measures put in place about how we talk about how we acquire surveillance technology and how we utilize them. And so we were able to work with a champion in City Council and, was able to get that passed through City Council for its first reading. And, I think that's just one issue. I think when we talk about surveillance and when we talk about minority communities such as mine, as Jesse said, San Diego is one example of this, being in a border town, being heavily militarized already. The fact that we have this extreme, ICE and CBP presence here, and the use of surveillance technologies often for immigration purposes and immigration enforcement, but also for criminalization of our communities. We have a strong joint terrorism task force here, which is literally the FBI not only collaborating with our local law enforcement, but deputizing our local law enforcement to do surveillance of our communities. We have fusion centers. We have so much funding that goes into the surveillance of our communities. And, here we are after the elections, and now we're in another conversation about how do we throw more money, more personnel, more task forces and collaborations, right, in a system that has already been criminalizing us, has been attacking us for decades. So
Thank you, Hamaira. And then lastly, because I love to keep things a little bit spicy, at the very last minute, I asked Dr. Lily Irani from UCSD if she would be willing to jump in here and co-facilitate it with us. And so Lily, if you want to do a quick introduction, and then I'll ask a general question to our panelists.
Sure. Hi, my name is Lily Irani. I'm an associate professor at UCSD, and I also organize with Tech Workers Coalition. And my connection to this issue is both, shares the elements with a lot of the panelists. So like Albert, I was a computer nerd, and I really believe the computers are there to make our lives better decades ago. And also, I'm Iranian American, and so post 9/11, I got a rude awakening about where Iranians sit in the hierarchy of humanity, and what kinds, in terms of what kinds of rights we were supposed to have in a nation that was newly thirsty to find people to blame. So I'm really grateful to have our panelists here for this discussion, because I think what happens in San Diego affects the whole country.
Absolutely. So kind of bringing us back to the topic of it. It occurred to me when I was sitting at home watching the January 6th event, whatever you want to call it, whether it's riot, insurrection, or et cetera, that we are really living through a historical moment. And talk about kind of a climax to an entire 4 years where it really wasn't too surprising, right? To all of a sudden see Blue Lives Matter flags and Trump flags storming the Capitol, right? And so it was only surprising for anybody who wasn't paying any attention to what was happening at all. Could you each, talk about on January 6th, how did what was happening in the Capitol come to your attention, and what were your thoughts? Where were you? What were your thoughts in that moment? I will start this time. Let's start with Albert.
Sure. So I remember very vividly watching the images on TV, and I remember my blood was boiling. I was so angry, and I felt so violated. I felt like our country was violated, that these people would try to overturn our election, undermine our democracy. And in that moment, I remember feeling like I wanted to do anything I could to find them. And that made me pause, and it really made me scared, because I knew if I was feeling that way, there are millions of people who are probably feeling that way too. And, the lesson of so many, attacks of the past is in these moments when we're gripped by fear and anger, and at times even righteous outrage, that can drive us to very dark places. That's the sort of event that led to the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which we put into place in the aftermath of Oklahoma City, and a bill that was implemented to target white extremists that later was used to execute overwhelmingly inmates of color. And I realized that we were facing the newest challenge to privacy, to civil rights, to the further acceleration of the surveillance state, because now we would see millions of people who had been skeptical of that power in the hands of the Trump administration and a conservative federal government, who would now be much more open to those tools if being used to supposedly target right-wing extremists. But the pattern is so clear that if we enable that sort of surveillance to target those who went after the Capitol, that it's going to simply give yet another tool to police that can be turned on BIPOC communities, the way these tools have been every time in the past, the way they inevitably are. And so I think that was our biggest concern. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight, the absurdity when you thought about it, is we didn't need any of this because people were live streaming their felonies. They were giving their names to reporters. They weren't hiding their identities. So the idea, this wasn't a case where we needed new tools. This was a case where police refused to use the tools they had because the attackers were white and conservative. Hope that wasn't too much of a rant.
Not at all. Perfect. Thank you. And whoever wants to go next can just hop in.
I'll take this one. So I had a similar reaction that Albert did, although I thought watching it from afar that it wasn't surprising, like you said, Khaled, but there was a sense of kind of melancholy, and there's a real deep-rooted sense of just like emptiness and almost nihilism to it. So for me, it was kind of pathetic, but it was scary at the same time. And so initially I had the same reaction, which was, how did this happen? How do we prevent this from happening again? But then I immediately thought back to what happened after 9/11. And I thought back to the domestic terrorism policies, which had established this benchmark of going after people who incite violence. And what we saw after 9/11 was that this definition of who's worthy of surveillance and who's worthy of being monitored fell under a category typically of political speech. So if you made a statement that was anti-American, or you created a video that was critical of American foreign policy, you would fall under the umbrella of the machinery of the state and you would be investigated for it. So the subsequent reaction I had to it, and I had to remind myself, was that this is going to be turned back on the American people. And that's incredibly unfortunate, because right-wing extremism ought to be monitored, but there are already tools, to Albert's point, existing in the law to prosecute people. And anyone who disagrees with that should just look back in the 1990s at what happened with Timothy McVeigh, right-wing extremist who blew up a government building, prosecuted pre-9/11, no problem whatsoever. So I think there's a benchmark that anyone who's pushing a domestic terrorism law or increased surveillance has to match. They have to explain why additional tools and additional dollars and resources are needed.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I was in the middle of meetings and Khaled called me. let me know what was happening. And I think for me, I have this like trauma response to things like that now. I mean, my first feeling was fear, right? I mean, these are white supremacists attacking the Capitol. I thought about like, who else are they going to attack? Is this going to be everywhere? How's that going to affect my community? Those were my first thoughts and reactions. I think it was, it wasn't until we started having these conversations about, what the response was, and this knee-jerk response of like, oh, we need to, we need to create these laws and things like that, that I was like, oh my gosh, this is just another example of how they're going to utilize this opportunity to come back and further surveil us.
I think Omar's unmuting himself. There we go.
I wish I could claim that I was doing some like anti-surveillance, evasive measures, but I just struggle with the unmute button. I mean, since we're being, honest, I also was, completely caught up in my own life and work that day, and the sort of the news and things were sort of popping up, and I was, I think, just sort of digesting it subconsciously until a little bit later on in the day when I got a chance to study it. And a couple of things come to mind. I absolutely second everything everyone has said, and there was that sort of sickening sense of where is this going to lead, because certainly it won't be someplace good for the the communities that I come from, that I represent. And that's worth talking about in some depth. But one particular aspect of my past work came to mind, and I think there's been, particularly in some of the movement spaces where I do work and with the communities that I represent, of a real interest in trying to think through how we start to like really operationalize the feeling of solidarity that a lot of us have. How do we start to make solidarity function to build like truly intersectional movements that respond to the way that the state and local law enforcement take the knees out from under our social movements through mechanisms of surveillance. Some of the documents that that came to light in the course of CCR's litigation with Color of Change around surveillance of the movement Black Lives, to me sort of says the things that I think we should all be saying, but sort of in the opposite and really perverse way, which is that we are in this movement response to surveillance together. It manifests the opposite way, right? So there, law enforcement, particularly the FBI and DHS, and within DHS, the Intelligence and Analysis Unit, was really concerned about the ways that Black protesters were responding to police violence, particularly in Ferguson and other uprisings. And some of the traffic around that work was just really kind of shocking and absurd, right? So in black and white emails talking about the potential for ISIS to recruit, the young Black folks that you saw in the streets in Ferguson, and not sort of like in an absurd way, but like here's something that we need to pay attention to, that ends up living, in FBI field reports. And so when you think about the highly militarized response to Black political speech, there's a way that it actually has, some logic and is built into the way surveillance gets rolled out to our communities. And so, thinking about that while watching, what was happening at the Capitol, to me was just, it's really sort of a mind-bending experience. And it's not unlike also the experience of seeing that, that I'm sure you all have this image in your mind as well, of the one Black Capitol Police officer who was trying to hold the mob at bay, and just the kind of like reversal of power in that dynamic. Some of it is, I think, was sort of characterized as restraint, but I also, and I'm sure that I was projecting, some sense of fear and recognition of like the claim of white supremacist power over whose country and whose space that actually was, that even as an armed, authorized, officer of the law, he had to respect in that moment. And so I guess, those things kind of come to mind and create a level of urgency, I think, to what can at times feel like a policy discussion or a, question about legal ethics. I think this stuff plays out in real ways for some communities that demands that we really think about how we organize and how we use both movement work, our legal, tools, and then also narrative telling, like real, like sharp storytelling about what surveillance means, right? Like the notion that surveillance is something that happens in secret and is just kind of like in the ether is nonsense. It's something that, Black and brown communities, Muslim communities live with, they have to navigate, they have to make choices around. And so, those things just sort of all came to life watching that episode.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, Omar, you already touched on this both in your introduction and what you just said, but you had talked about the similarities in how the state treats those that they suspect of being terrorists and activists. And you also just referenced this with the Color of Change documents. As a panel, but maybe starting with Omar, what are the similarities in how the state treats those two groups, and what is demanded of movements in terms of how we approach the category of terrorist?
Yeah, I mean, it's why I was, my response to that is, kind of partly why I was so interested in being part of this discussion. I'm really interested in the way that crises, whether they're real crises or imagined crises, create this sort of imperative for expanded power and more tools in order to respond to, a particular community that is presumptively threatening by virtue of their position with respect to fundamentally white supremacist power in this country. And so to me, it seems like the same kind of two-step maneuver when something, really unsettling happens. It tends to put, and it's not just, folks who are opposed to this sort of organizing, but even our own communities, it puts us a little closer in the shoes of the state, shoes of law enforcement. And it makes folks feel like, the current tools, the ability of law enforcement to prosecute unlawful conduct once it's happened is not enough. And that's somehow there needs to be a predictive model that allows us to understand in advance where the threat is coming from and neutralize it so we can all feel safe. And as Albert mentioned, as other folks have mentioned and understand in their work, like that is just a one-way ratchet that ends up getting used to, not just to surveil for watching, but I think in like some particularly intentional ways to make it harder to raise the burden of organizing and doing the kind of intersectional movement building that is so desperately needed. I mean, I think really any kind of meaningful social change that happens because targeted communities, historically disfavored communities, demand that change. And so if it becomes so threatening, so scary, or so disruptive to their lives, right, that can happen, then I think we all suffer. It makes me think about some of the ways that surveillance is in fact and is intended to be very much in the open and for everyone to see, right? Like that's some of what's happened. I think if folks are familiar with the no-fly list litigation in Tanvir, like for the FBI and local law enforcement to show up at your place of work and invite you out to have a conversation, or to show up at your home, is meant to isolate you and to make sure that no one wants to be associated with you, because because then you have no way of speaking out, you have no way of organizing. And so, to me, though, that happens whether it's, post 9/11 counterterrorism paradigm and the folks at the tip of the spear are Muslim communities, or whether it's, the long and tortured history of Black folks in this country. It's of a piece to my mind.
And if I could just add to that, I think the historical parallels, I mean, there's so many to choose from. That's what's so maddening about this. It's the same cycle keeps happening. And we've talked about, the parallels to post 9/11. We've talked about the parallels to 1996, but look at the Red Squads, the anti-communist policing and anti-anarchist policing that also morphed into, quote, Black squads that were systematically targeting Black-led movements and political movements. We always have had this idea that we need a separate track of policing that has greater powers, that has greater autonomy when people are engaging in movements that destabilize our racial, economic, and other orders within the country. And I think that where we create these additional powers in the name of, what can be real concerns about national security, they end up being then utilized in this racialized framework where they're then systematically targeted at the same communities that we always target. And that's part of what is always so, this is why whenever any police department says we need a new tool, and I don't care what that tool is, it could be a $100 drone, it could be a $50,000 facial recognition system. When they say they need that new tool, the question is, you need that new tool to track whom and to serve whom, because oftentimes those are very different answers.
Yeah, I guess I would just tack on that and say that this point you guys have made about the blurring of state, federal, and local law enforcement is intentional, right? It's supposed to be a shifting of the tools of intelligence down on the local level. All that's by design, and I think it's also important to keep in mind the history and the context of where surveillance comes from and why. And the truth is that it was largely a lot of the tools that seem benign, that don't seem to have any overt partisan or ideological values to them, in fact, do, because they were born out of the Pentagon. I mean, the internet itself was. During the Vietnam War, the Pentagon was trying to bug the jungles of Vietnam. I mean, there was clearly a purpose behind the creation of surveillance tools for many, many decades. So to see them then turned on people as a tool of counterinsurgency is honestly not surprising whatsoever. These things are doing what they were designed to do, but officials tend to roll these out while claiming that they're being impartial and while claiming that they're just, they're scientific in a sense. They're just reviewing the data to see what it says, but they don't, or at least they forget that these tools have ideologies behind them.
Are you waiting for me, Howard? Or are you trying to make
now
us
I'm
all-
having muting issues. Who's behind this? Who's behind this? So, Hamaira, I know you're the last person. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about kind of like, how is it that government surveillance or state surveillance kind of blends kind of the tools that are used supposed to be addressing terrorism? I think this was the original question. Tools that are used to address terrorism versus tools that end up being used to surveil and prosecute activists.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Joint Terrorism Task Force and these collaborations that exist are intentionally designed, right, to blur those lines and to, the premise is always like, oh, we need more collaboration to exist. That's how we're going to prevent future things like this from happening, right? And that's not the case. It's just meaning that they're going to have more folks on the ground, right, that are going to be surveilling our communities. And I think that, when Albert was talking about, the history of these things, and to me, I feel like we really have to look at, like, not only is surveillance the issue, but what happens from surveillance, right? Like, our communities are first surveilled, And then what's the product of that? I mean, the truth of the matter is, like, post September 11th, there was, these terrorist watch lists that were created, right? Where folks have, where basically the government used these discriminatory identifiers of who could be a potential terrorist, right? And then went and criminalized us. And then they used informants to then come and literally, basically frame youth for acts of terrorism that hadn't occurred, but there was some intention behind it, right? We see that happening in California and probably across the country as well, with these like Cal Gang, these gang databases, right? Where Black and brown youth are basically, identified and surveilled, and then are used to then later on go and like accuse them of committing crimes that, half of which they didn't commit. It was through some form of association of, someone who lived in their block or whatnot. And so I think that those are the reasons why for me and my community, surveillance is such a huge issue, as well as what other folks talked about. The fact that when, we go to the Muslim community and we try to organize them around events, especially the refugee community who, many of which are new Americans, I mean, they don't even want to engage. If there's a whole political education process that has to happen to get folks to work past that fear.
And if I could just add something quickly, I wanted to add a vocabulary word to tonight's conversation, which is tech washing. And Jesse was getting to this earlier. And I think this is something a bunch of us have hit on, that this creates a veneer of objectivity. But what we see with these systems is just what Hamaira is talking about, that even these systems are then targeted in the discriminatory manner, but the police always say, oh no, it's the data. Yeah, oh no, it's objective. But the truth is they're just tech washing the human decisions with this veneer of objectivity.
Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful. And many of you spoke eloquently about the history, generally speaking, about the history of surveillance in the United States and its kind of roots and kind of, the bloody history of racism and how that has played out. Can you talk about how today, because of technological advances, because San Diego has been bragging about it being the first quote unquote smart city, right? That enabled, we found out, in large part due to Jesse's reporting, that that these street lights that had been passed as kind of environmental, climate saving light bulbs turned out to be a gigantic surveillance system, which, surprise, surprise, was really only being used by the police. And it wasn't to help people recycle. Can you talk a little bit about how, the emerging technologies that we see every day, how does that change the whole conversation around surveillance that has already been problematic, but how does the new emergence of technologies impact this conversation? And anybody can feel free to jump in and answer.
Well, one thing is it makes it so much cheaper. When the US Air Force wanted to get the location data for 90 million Muslims, they didn't need tracking devices and confidential informants. They just brought the location data from a popular prayer time app. When the NYPD wants to identify everyone at a political protest, they don't need to methodically question them and have all of this investment. They can take one photo, use facial recognition. This makes it so much easier, so much cheaper to expand the perpetual tracking systems and to really enable all of the abuses that come from that. And we have to be clear, when we're talking about surveillance, there's the privacy concern, there's the civil rights concern, but I think Hamaira was talking about this before, that it's just the first step. When we're talking about people being tracked by facial recognition, it means wrongful arrest, it means wrongful conviction, but it also means a SWAT team at someone's door. It means a knee to the neck. It means all of the violence inherent in any police encounter. And that's the gravity of this. It's bringing people into harm's way, overwhelmingly BIPOC Americans, because they are being targeted by systems which are oftentimes explicitly racist against them, as with facial recognition. And so just think about it. every time you take a step outside your door, the cameras, the cell phone tracking, the other forms of location tracking, your Fitbit, a vaccine passport, all of these systems create a web of data which can constantly be mined and constantly used to target you. And no matter how much we talk about being sanctuary cities and sanctuary states and sanctuary jurisdictions, if you have a joint terrorism task force in your community, you're not a sanctuary city. If you have a fusion center sharing data between police and federal agents, you are not in a sanctuary city. And we have this rhetoric, but data sharing turns it into a lie.
If I can just quickly jump in, I mean, I absolutely, I agree with that. And I was thinking about something Hamaira said just earlier. It's of course it's the case, right, that that surveillance, widespread surveillance, and particularly the kind of technologically efficient surveillance that we are grappling with now produces wrongful and unjustified law enforcement intervention in people's lives. There's no doubt about it. But it's also true, and this is why I think we all have to really wrestle with the calls for abolition right now, is that if you're watched 24 hours a day, if law enforcement has access to the full scope of your daily life, it's quite likely that you have in fact broken some laws, or people that you love or your family have broken laws that make them vulnerable in a formally legalistic way, vulnerable to justify prosecution. And so I think, again, like that's where, particularly for Black and Brown communities, for Muslim communities, historically disfavored communities, we have to be a little bit bolder in our demands for accountability around law enforcement targeting, because none of us are able to stay, I think, really on the right side of the law when we're being scrutinized in that way. And that is also, I think, another dynamic that plays out in a lot of communities, which is that if I somehow keep my head down and pay my taxes and do the right things, then I just don't need to really worry about this, and I can steer clear of it. And I've just seen from from my work, and I know others on this call know it's their work as well, that's just not the way it works. And so I'm also interested in sort of wrestling with what it means for all of us to be watched perpetually, and how we should think about law enforcement in light of that.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to go into a little bit more of, like, I think I'm getting a question in the chat in terms of explaining a little bit more of what some of these infrastructures look like for collaboration, right? So we briefly mentioned, like, the Joint Terrorism Task Force is one example of this. That is, it's a FBI task force, basically, where they partner with local law enforcement agencies. So that can be everything from the sheriff to your local, San Diego Police Department, Chula Vista, whatnot. And they, work together. Some of this is around, like, the data, right, that Albert was referring, and Omar as well, right, the data sharing that occurs. And one of the reasons why, I really, really appreciated that comment that if you have a joint terrorism task force in your locality, you're not really a sanctuary city, because there are so many collaborations and information sharing that occur within these agencies, right? And these task forces could be everything from personnel. So, that San Diego Police Department police officer that comes and knocks at your door and asks you questions, then all of a sudden is asking you about, like, well, what about that trip you took last year, and a few months ago internationally? What did you do, right? You don't know that when you're talking to a police officer, you're actually talking basically to an FBI agent, right? And that information can be used against you to prosecute you on all sorts of things that you have no idea about, or be used on a case for somebody else. There was a state legislation that we attempted, PANA co-sponsored this with many of our allies, including, like, Asian Law Caucus and other folks, to try to provide some level of transparency as to, like, how many, how many officers are there? What are they doing? What kind of information is being gathered, right? All of these things. However, that state legislation halted because of COVID, but other localities like Oakland and San Francisco have actually been able to get rid of these task forces altogether. And so there's, advocacy measures to do similar things in other localities across the state of California.
And can I just say, as a New Yorker, I am constantly like so impressed at everything like activists across California are doing, and just in awe. It's like we're just trying to keep up and replicate some of the successes you've had, because it really continues to set the standard for so much of the country.
I appreciate you. Oh, go ahead, Jesse.
No, sorry, Hamaira.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I appreciate you saying that, but I do want to just state that San Diego looks very different from the Bay Area. So that bill, the main opposition was actually the San Diego sheriffs. There's a state bill that's being introduced around domestic terrorism and creating a task force that's going to work on these issues. And the only sponsor is the DA of San Diego, so we've got a lot of work to do here. Go ahead, Jesse.
No, that's interesting. I actually didn't even know that. So that's a good little tip. Thank you. So I just wanted to tack on a little bit and say that the as we all probably know, the purpose of surveillance typically tends to, it's supposed to have a psychological effect, right? And you'll often hear officials kind of talk about how they buy these things and approve these things as a deterrent for one reason or another. But your question, Khalid, had been about the effect and the response to revealing some of these projects for what they actually are. And I think there's an argument to be made that the projects themselves say more about the people in positions of authority and power than they do about the people who are actually being watched and monitored. And so specifically, if you look at something like the smart streetlights, now what was the purpose of it? It was sold as an environmental tool. It was a public planning tool. They were going to attach sensors to every single streetlight, literally 3,000 to 4,000 of them, so that you could monitor traffic and pedestrians, and then you could create apps on top of that, blah, blah, blah. But they didn't know what they were actually rolling out or what they were doing. And then it turns out that the technology didn't even work all that well in the end. So what happened was, because they didn't ask the right questions, because they didn't anticipate the fact that law enforcement would want these devices, or maybe they did, right? But that's how it evolved over the long term in any case. It became just a tool for the police department. And so I bring all of this up to say it's ironic that the point of the streetlights in San Diego was a matter of public planning as well as a matter of deterrence and control. But in the process, city officials gave up some of their control to the private companies that actually own these devices and own the underlying technology. So what we saw last summer was a private company based in Florida, which owned the actual tech, had said, even though we understand your city council wants to defund this thing, they want to shut it down until there are stronger rules in place, we're just going to keep it on in any case. And we're going to keep it on, and we're going to give the police department access. And they were able to do that because the mayor consented to it. He didn't prevent it. He might have been able to do that. But my point is, a company which exists on the other part of the United States, none of its members were ever elected. None of them are held accountable in San Diego. They made a unilateral decision that they were going to do this, that they were going to keep on the video and they were going to keep monitoring people in San Diego, and they were going to give the footage to law enforcement. And that should frighten everybody.
I'm not sure if Omar is doing fancy hands to unmute or if he's going to talk. Okay, Lily, I think you have another question.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm really hearing in what you all are talking about is, one, for me, Hamaira, the way you described the way that, JTTF puts more people on the ground surveilling communities actually was a little bit of a mind blower for me, because it kind of reminded me that, even if people usually talk about the digital technology as creating all these data traces and then creating a dragnet, but what you're saying is actually Muslim communities and probably like Black communities, other kinds of communities that threaten the racialized order that Albert was talking about, like they already have been getting the dragnet without all the fancy digital technology. And then given the kind of complexity of who even has agency over this digital technology, who can kind of track what's going on with it. I wanted to ask you all about promising policy approaches, because for certain technologies like face recognition, people will say there are people who make the argument that there's no good enough use of this technology, and there are so many terrible uses that actually it should just be banned. Refusal is the strategy. And then, but we've been seeing in a lot of cities also ordinances that are about getting transparency and oversight by elected officials over surveillance technology. Some of us have been working on getting that done here in San Diego. So, what are promising approaches you see out there? What are the problems of some of the common approaches you see out there for kind of empowering the intersectional organizing and not making this, not getting us into a bunch of work that's just legitimizing the technologies and putting a rubber stamp on it?
So I'm happy to talk a bit about this. So I think there's a lot of dangers out there. So I think warrants, for example, warrant requirements, even super warrant requirements, those often offer false hope of equity, because where there's a discretionary policy, even where there's supposedly checks and balances from the judges, we see these patterns of systemic bias in who is considered a threat, who is targeted with that warrant application, and just the decades of the judicial system acquiescing to discrimination surveillance. So I strongly believe in a philosophy of surveillance abolition, of just trying to abolish these systems of mass surveillance. And so yes, that means abolishing facial recognition, but also abolishing drones, predictive policing, social media monitoring, a lot of the tools that really, if you had asked the American people 10 years ago, is this acceptable in a democracy, they would have said no. But we are the proverbial frog that's been brought to a boil. And so now we think, oh, yeah, they can scrape that data off of Facebook. Is that a big deal? Yeah, it's a big deal, because those are the things that fuel the gang databases, that fuel the information sharing agreements, that are part of the high intensity drug trafficking area fusion center you have in San Diego, that really enable all of these mass surveillance systems. The transparency bills you talked about, CCOPS, community controlled police surveillance, I think that's also an important part of the solution, but if it's done as part of this larger effort to eliminate these surveillance systems, because you can't ban something that you can't see. And without CCOPS bills, which require the police to disclose what tools they're using and actually empower, in some cases like Oakland, an independent privacy commission to hold police accountable, there's really no way to know what law you have to pass in order to ban the next abusive tool. But on their own, just transparency on its own, like we have in New York right now, that clearly is not enough. And that's why, we finally got transparency last year, but now we're going to be working to ban a lot of those tools here as well.
Remember when people were upset about wiretapping? And now look where we are.
Oh, the good old days.
Right. I remember being upset about that. Yeah, no, I think Albert, you're absolutely right. I mean, we've been trying to pass this in San Diego for over a year, and Lily and myself have been really heavily involved in looking at, policies across the country and recognizing the limitations of them. I think to me, the most important element of it is of course, the transparency, but also creating this privacy advisory board or commission that is actually it needs to be community led and driven, right? A bunch of talking heads that report back to the city or whatnot, it's not going to work. And I think for having that community involvement in this process and how we how we talk about it, giving us an opportunity to organize. I mean, with the smart streetlights camera, most of our organizations didn't even know that was in existence and that police had exclusive access to these cameras, right, for years, right? There was never a conversation that happened. But being able to require that the city, before they bring a proposal to city councils around technology, that they go into communities and they actually do these workshops, and also are able to have this like advisory process. I think those are, you know, to me, the most innovative pieces of this, or most important. I agree that they're limited just talking about transparency. And also, you know, then the city city saying like, well, there might be some information that's you know, too sensitive for us to share, right? Those are really valid issues that I think we need to continue to work on and make sure that there is like true transparency and oversight over these things.
Can I ask a quick question? I'm thinking about Jesse's comments about you know, just private actors with such a massive profit motive in rolling out these kinds of technologies, and once they're live and have been deployed, how easy it is for them to be sort of handed over and transferred. And is it? I just wonder for all of us, like, you know, how do we think about moving our advocacy and our resistance away from law enforcement to increase some accountability on corporations, and to have, you know, to have advanced insight into what the next thing is, so that we can make a determination for ourselves, or at least social movements can, and what the potential implications are. It feels to me, even as much as I'm involved in this, that it feels a little bit late. You know, once there's a new tech that's out there that's canvassed all of our lives digitally, to try to claw back you know, what the downstream effects are for our lives. I just wonder where folks come out on that.
I really want to call out the amazing work by Media Justice and Mahente, the No Tech for ICE campaign, the work being done on corporate accountability against a number of vendors, and Amazon as well. And also the Athena Coalition, which has been doing a ton of work on the intersection of Amazon's sort of growing surveillance state and how it empowers police. And also oh gosh, I'm blanking out. There are a number of groups that have been also using shareholder resolutions to target corporations on this as well. But you know, I think I completely agree. It's like, it's not enough to hold the government accountable if there's a complete workaround through the state. And just at the risk of self-promoting too much, we'll be announcing that we have a class action lawsuit against a major surveillance vendor for ICE and the police tomorrow. So that's embargoed for now, but very much looking forward to suing them.
Albert, that's actually very interesting, because I'm struggling to think of an answer, an acceptable answer to Omar's question, which I think is a great one. You know, I'm not a consumer of a company like Ubiquia, which owns the streetlights here in San Diego. I don't really have much of any authority to put any pressure on them to change things, but it seems like the legal system is one route. Albert, could you actually like say a little bit more about what you guys are doing? Because that sounds really interesting and potentially useful to more people here.
Well, I mean, I let me talk about another one so I'm not revealing the things that are currently embargoed. But if you look at Clearview Ai, so the Clearview Ai is one of the most pernicious surveillance vendors in the country. They not only set up a facial recognition system, but they scraped billions of photos from social media in order to create a massive database of everyone probably on this webinar, and to then sell that to law enforcement so they could be so that our data could be their product, and then we could be searched as a result. And so there we saw the ACLU bringing a case under Illinois' Biometric Information Privacy Act, or BIPA. And then in more recent days, we saw efforts, I believe it was by Mahente, to sue them in California under, I believe it was CalECPA, and the CCPA. So I do think we see a growing number of companies being sued for the work they're doing on behalf of surveillance vendors, and particularly California, because I think, you know, other than the Illinois biometric law, generally the strongest laws in the country on this issue are in California. And so there are potentially a lot of ways, if you are being tracked, to leverage the court system to go after those responsible.
So I know Lily and I have had some discussions on this, and she has done so much thought and advocacy around this. So Lily, do you want to respond to that question as well?
Sure. I mean, just in addition to what Albert was talking about, which is, I learned a lot from that actually. I mean, one of the ways that I've been seeing this happen is in terms of corporate accountability in tech is, there's things that workers in tech have been doing. So No Tech for ICE involved, students, activists on campus saying, we don't want to have Palantir recruit on our campus. And Palantir actually ended up finding it so difficult to recruit in Silicon Valley that they moved their corporate headquarters to Colorado, where I'm sure they'll still have no trouble hiring people, but at least it creates costs for them for the software they build that is crucial to kind of law enforcement infusion centers. Another example of that was Google workers saying that they don't want to work on AI to process drone surveillance over the Middle East. And as somebody who knows some of the workers that were involved with that, there was an element of kind of solidarity politics involved with that. There were people involved with that had friends or family members that were in the Middle East, and they didn't, so they were saying, we refuse to let our labor be used for that. Now Google doesn't build it, and it does, then Lockheed will, make the bid to build it. But through those fights, it kind of pushes these conversations into a wider arena, at least. And I think it does make it more difficult for some of these technologies to get built when workers refuse. But we've also been seeing in tech that workers who speak out get summarily fired or raked across the coals in the media. And so if we want to, to the extent that we celebrate tech worker organizing as part of this kind of solidarity politics that we've been talking about, can we also talk about whistleblower protections or, other kinds of due process rights for workers, not getting fired so easily, which is a problem across our economy in the United States. And then the other piece of the corporate accountability that I wanted to mention is our agency is people who are part of a public, so in Oakland, Brian Hoffer of Secure Justice, who helped us a ton with the surveillance ordinance here in San Diego, was saying that they were trying to pass an ordinance, or maybe they did, where Oakland would not buy any technologies from companies that had contracts with ICE. As part of the sanctuary city movement, they're saying, okay, let's use our power as buyers. And the tech industry is really trying to expand out of the consumer market into the government market, because capitalism, they got to keep growing and finding new sources of profit. So, we can also be asking, how do we leverage our role as people who can push the public sector in also creating some of that accountability? And others might have other ideas, projects that I haven't kind of covered, Albert hasn't covered. Albert, you might have more ideas.
I wanted to, because we're kind of coming up towards the end and towards when we want to bring in some audience questions. But before that, I just wanted to talk about, a couple of our panelists have referenced gang databases and how gang documentation and surveillance kind of can be directly connected to us. I just, that's one of the things that we deal with a lot at Pillars of the Community that many people don't know, that in California, we have a gang database that people can be, there's 8 or 9 criteria. And if you just reach a couple of those criteria, you can be labeled as a gang member in this database, which then has all of these consequences that essentially turn you into a second-class citizen. So if you've been surveilled and written down that you're wearing a gang dress in a gang neighborhood, read any color in any community of color, you can reach those things. Talking to somebody who's a known or suspected gang member, right, is enough to document you as a gang member. So how these surveillance systems can have consequences that end up in court with you getting these large enhancements where you're charged with more than the crime, or in cases like Penal Code 182.5, where your only crime is your association with the community that you're from. An extremely important topic. But I guess the question that I wanted to ask before opening it up to some of the audience questions is, when I was watching the insurrection and the violence that was happening at the Capitol, and I'm somebody who's worked on, abolition work and working on criminal justice reforms on the way towards abolition, kind of on every different level. I was like, yay, they're finally going to arrest some of these other people. And, you know, this kind of, you know, maybe if, what's the guy, he was dressed kind of like the Lost Boys from Peter Pan, right? Who he got locked up and all of a sudden he's getting, you know, vegan food and all types of stuff. Maybe if we lock up more privileged white people, the conditions of the prisons will change for everybody, right? I, I only say that in just partially, but I think part of this comes from this kind of deep-rooted feeling that many of us have, that we have good guys and bad guys. And I've seen the movies and watched the TV show, enough TV shows to know that law enforcement are always the good guys. And as long as I'm not doing anything bad, if I'm not committing any crimes, if I'm not anything, why should I care about surveillance? So can you just kind of, in this general sense, kind of answer that question? Hey, if I'm not doing anything wrong, why should I care whether the good guys are, you know, watching me, you know, shop on Amazon, or watching me, you know, drive my kids to school?
So this is one of those questions where I always say the answer is one size fits none, because you know the thing that will resonate with one person will fall completely flat with another. So if I'm talking to a progressive student group, and I can talk about the NYPD abuses, and that might resonate. If I'm going to a mosque, I can talk about the FBI infiltration, and that will resonate. But if I'm going on Fox News, I can talk about the IRS, and that will resonate. Like there are always points of sensitivity in our life, things that we feel vulnerable. We feel that pressure if someone else can control the information about whether we're there. Maybe it's whether we're going to church on Sunday or going to the mosque on Friday. Maybe it's maybe it's someone who's being unfaithful to their spouse, that information becomes very powerful, you know. And there are always these things where that information turns into control. And so I think this is why it really, to go back to what Omar was talking about, it's storytelling, and it's highly contextual storytelling that talks about the specific fears, the specific concerns, and the specific power dynamics of those in the audience. Because with all of these things, the harms aren't abstract or philosophical. The harms are always going to be concrete.
Anybody else?
I would just add, I mean, I think in your question is baked in some of the dynamic that, you know, that leads to sort of, you know, widespread acceptance of surveillance, which is that for too long, I think many who enjoy relative privilege and positional power in this country have been pretty much okay with widespread surveillance. And so the question is really, I mean, even if you could arrive at a conclusion that you're fine with a degree of surveillance in your own life because you live such a squeaky clean life and you never cross anyone or break any laws, which you know, I'm skeptical of. But even if you can arrive at that conclusion, you know, the question is really what about the, you know, the other members of your society who are disfavored? And as I said at the beginning, because I look at some of the successes that came out of, for example, the organizing of the Muslim community around the NYPD surveillance, and those changes, like very, very hard fought improvements to the way the NYPD approaches, you know, they benefit everyone, right? Those changes were not specific to that case. They got folded into, as I think folks know, like the Handshake Consent Decree, which governs all of the NYPD's conduct as it relates to political activity and freedom of religion. And so everyone enjoys that benefit. And so if, you know, again, I think that's where the, you know, the organizing and the solidarity really, really matters. So, I mean, I get your question. I think it's a real challenge, especially now, because I think it is a natural reaction for folks who've been at the tip of the spear for so long to say, okay, well, now we'll see some application of power that makes some sense. Like at least there'll be an internal logic, and it'll make sense that those folks are getting prosecuted. But you know, I tend to think that's a little bit short-sighted, as much as natural as it is.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you know.
Let me just say, first time that I've been called short-sighted on a nationally televised panel. Thank you very much, Brother Omar. I appreciate it. Hamaira,
Yeah, great. Yeah, first time we spoke. Great to meet you. You know I didn't mean it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's this sense of like, man, we've been targeted for ages, and now finally, right? Some folks who we know have been doing all sorts of things, right? The white supremacists who've been attacking us, who, you know, hate crimes that have killed us, who target us, you know, are finally getting something. And you know, there's this whole conversation about, you know, the word terrorism, and like, we need to call these folks terrorists, right? And then other folks saying, no, there is, you know, that word, it has just become something that has become so problematic that it does us more harm to utilize it, you know? And I think that's, you know, I think those conversations are important to have for us, you know, even within the Muslim community, and the broader Amamsa community. I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of folks who are like, you know, when we started talking about streetlights, and we have a steering committee that's like, you know, all refugee. And when I started talking to them, they're like, you know, in Syria, people, you know, there was police that come in like, kill me. Like, you're just talking about a light outside of my house. I don't care. I'm not doing anything wrong, right? But then once you start talking about the implications of that, well, you know, a hijabi girl is walking down the street and she looks up, and then police come in, you know, question her or something like that. And you talk about the implications of that and what that could mean for folks, right? Like, I don't think that people make the direct associations, you know, to immigration consequences. Like when I was talking about these lists before that were created, no-fly list, terrorist watch list, all of these things. And then all of a sudden you're applying for citizenship. You've done nothing wrong, but you went to some mosque 5 years ago, and now you're on some list, and now it's been, you know, 10 years and you're still on this database, and you don't even know it, and you don't know why, you know, they keep delaying your immigration interview, right? Like, folks need to understand what the implications of these surveillance things are, and how that can affect them. And I think that there's a lack of understanding there.
Thank you. So I think Lily has a question from the audience.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to merge two questions around, you know, there's folks in the audience who have been organizing in Chula Vista, which like San Diego, the police department was using a Vigilant Systems automated license plate reader and then broadcasting all those license plates to hundreds and hundreds of agencies. But also there's a recent story about how Chula Vista is kind of the drone innovation capital of the United States. And so one of the questions was, you know, what advice could you offer to activists in Chula Vista for, you know, addressing what, you know, this kind of what seems to be like this endless sequence of technologies that their city seems pretty invested in? And then maybe a kind of a flip side to that question is, what should employees in city government be asking or doing if they are moved by this panel and they want to kind of work in the spirit that this panel is trying to collectively guide us towards?
For the second question, I'm happy to talk to that first, because I feel like I have absolutely zero credibility to tell local activists in Chula Vista what will or won't work in your community. You know way better than I do. But in terms of, you know, the city procurement, one question that doesn't get asked nearly enough, and I would love to see asked a lot more, is what's the proof that this works? The next time someone tries to sell you a smart street lamp or a facial recognition system or a smart toothbrush or a smart whatever, like, people will put the word smart in front of something, mark it up about 100-fold, and then tell you it's the greatest thing ever. Ask, what's the evidence that works? What's the evidence from a third party that it works? What's been the certification that it works? Because 9 times out of 10, people they'll come out empty. You know, and that's something we have to keep in mind. We sometimes frame this as like a trade-off between the benefits of smart streetlights and the invasiveness, the benefits of these new surveillance systems and the civil rights concern. Most of it is just snake oil. Most of it is like, most of it works about as well as hydroxychloroquine. This stuff is junk science, but it's junk science that, you know, we're willing to pick up the tab for a lot in city government. So I would say, even if you aren't comfortable with some of the other broader abolitionist aims, that should be an easy ask that any office can support.
I mean,
I was just gonna,
oh, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. No, please go ahead, Hamaira. Oh, wait.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, you know, I think the Trust Coalition has done so much work around this locally in the city of San Diego. And I think there's natural collaborations there, and some that has already existed. But I think looking at, similar to like when smart streetlights first happened, right? And then we're like, okay, do we create a policy just around this, or do we look at like the whole picture, right? And I think in Chula Vista, it's really similar. It's like, you know, first we're talking about the driver's license, or what is it called? License plate readers. And that the fact that information was being shared with immigration enforcement. And now we're also talking about the use of these drones. I mean, I think unless we have a broader you know, policies that govern these things, I think there's always going to be another technology, another, you know, another new shiny thing. And like Albert said, you know, it's talking about the implications of it. It's talking about the costs, right? And not the cost that the salesperson sells it to these city councils with, right? It's always more than that, right? And having those conversations about, you know, what are the real civil rights implications of those things.
I was just going to offer quickly, you know, yeah, like, you know, as a attorney, I would never, you know, our approach is to follow the, you know, the lead of organizers and movement actors if we're representing them. So I wouldn't presume to tell the Chula Vista folks how to approach the challenge. I would just say, and if not for you, perhaps for others, you know, CCR has an open records project that we use to sort of like help activists, organizers, and movements acquire the information they feel they need to arm themselves to get organized around what kind of policy or you know, positions they might want to take, or what sort of advocacy they want to do. And that can be, as you know, the support can be as easy as, you know, a training on how to do Freedom of Information Act requests yourself, or support going through the process. And so if there are those kinds of like practical things that can be useful, please feel free to reach out to me and I can get you to the right people.
I guess the only other thing I would have to add is that it helps to actually read the materials that you're given. In San Diego, the city officials who were tasked with actually deciding whether or not to approve the project never bothered to read fine print. And in the fine print with the Streetlights project, it actually talked about surveillance, and it talked about gunshot detection software that could be built into it, but not a single person actually pulled that out and asked any questions about it. Instead, the entire conversation was focused on the interest rate of the loan that they were taking out to pay for these things. And so I just think we've set the bar so low here that any amount of revision, I think, is beneficial. So for what it's worth.
Just in case anybody was wondering why California was so great, as one of our people praised, as we just said, well, we don't exactly read the legislation. That's why we have the ensuing shit show that follows. So, I mean, I think this is kind of to that point. You know, Jesse, I think you mentioned earlier, and this is one of the questions that we have, that what are some of the questions that city employees, this is to the entire panel though, what are some of the questions that city employees and policymakers should be making around these decisions that are involving technology? And what I'll add to that is, how is reporting around these issues? What is reporting around these issues doing right, and what is it doing wrong? So I know I'm conflating a lot. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time, but if any of you can kind of answer either or both or some of those, that'd be great.
I guess I can just jump in real quick on the reporting question, Khalid, because I think the claims of officials have been taken at face value for a very, very long time. And I think that's been one of the problems with the journalism here locally. I don't think there's been a lot of digging after the fact to see whether these claims have come to fruition. And to Albert's point, a lot of times this technology is not as effective as it's sold. And so just by, like, for me personally, like one example I can offer is with the ShotSpotter technology, the gunshot detection. It was sold to us as being this thing that was rarely going to create a false alarm, and it was going to be less than 1% of the time. But all we did was just pull the calls for service and compared the police department's own notes in response to ShotSpotter alerts, and found that that number was actually like 25 times higher. So I guess it just requires people to be more aggressive and adversarial in positions of media.
We need more Jessies.
Thank you.
Jesse runs the intern program at Voice of San Diego as well, so working on.
Yeah, I mean, I think for our coalition and the amount of, attention that Jesse has been able to bring to these issues and the level of investigative reporting has been really, really helpful for folks to understand this, and then other news outlets to also pick this up. And, it's become a national story and all of those things. But I think it's been super, super important for us locally.
Anybody else want to jump in? What are some of the questions? Because we haven't talked at all about employees, right? We have employees that are enforcing these things, that are using these technologies, city employees. What are some of the questions, that we should be asking, that elected officials should be asking, or that city employees should be asking?
Beyond the efficacy point, maybe how much data is it collecting? How's that data secured? Who has access to that data? How long do they have access for it? What are the safeguards against like an unauthorized party getting access to this? Because keep in mind, when you create a surveillance system, you're not just creating a giant pool of data for the government, you're creating a giant pool of data for whoever breaks in. And there isn't a federal agency out there that hasn't been hacked, and local agencies aren't going to fare much better. And so I think those are issues. Anytime there's a claim about artificial intelligence, we've seen this with facial recognition, but this is true across the board. We see voice print analytics, where supposed Securus is one firm that claims to be able to predict who's going to commit a crime in the future based off of AI analysis of their voice. There's no science for that. I mean, this is high tech for knowledge, but we have to have a lot of pushback on, hey, is this scientific claim even plausible? Because a lot of the time it's not. And this is something that we're going to see a lot of, and I know this is a somewhat controversial technology to bring up, but here in New York, we have the first vaccine passport in the country. And this is not a vaccine passport for international travel, but a vaccine passport that you need to go to to see the Nets or go to the Rangers, to our hockey team. This is something that will be rolled out for concert venues, for a lot of other venues. And this is something we've been pushing back a lot on, because we pointed out that, hey, this isn't even following CDC guidance on how you should reopen spaces. And as much as we want to make sure everyone gets the vaccine as soon as possible, the idea that somehow if you have an app that everyone installs, that will solve issues as complicated as vaccine hesitance and promote trust, it's nonsense. It's really, and we've seen this with a lot of COVID tech throughout, whether it's exposure notification apps or thermal imaging scanners that just don't work. And so really, I think this past year has to be a real warning sign of how quickly people can accept technology that isn't helping when they just desperately want to believe that it's possible.
So Lily, I think you have kind of the wrap-up question. We have a question from Dave Myers. I think it's a good way to kind of close us out. I'll shoot.
Yeah,
I have a follow-up question to that one too. So I kind of lied. If people can stay around a little extra, I have another question, but Lily, take it away.
Okay. Yeah, and quickly, Albert, with the vaccine passport, I think one of the things that a friend of mine, Seda Gurses, who's doing research on vaccine passports for international travel, one of the points that she emphasizes is that once you install this infrastructure of everyone having this kind of passport, that infrastructure gets used for a bunch of different stuff. And so I think that kind of underscores a lot of what a lot of you all as panelists have been warning us about, with Omar talking about, is it too late to claw back some of the ways that our data traces are being taken? It's not just about this or use, it's about laying down infrastructures that can sense, measure, and kind of give away data about us. In ways that kind of create a Pandora's box. The question, I was going to merge some really good nuts and bolts questions by Dave Myers and John Earl. So Dave Myers was pointing out in the chat that police in San Diego have been using cell phone surveillance software. So they'll take protesters in for like Black Lives Matter protesters, and they'll plug their cell phone into a device and get a bunch of data. And I believe they don't need warrants to do that. I think Voice reported on it. And so he's wondering, is that happening in other places as well? And then John Earl asks kind of about a related phenomena, which is, Albert, you had mentioned the police can sell the contents and of the police can buy from data brokers information about individuals. And can you give us just a concrete example of how and where this happens? I think people are trying to understand the mechanics of how policing and surveillance kind of connect as practices.
Sure. So basically, our Fourth Amendment, it was written back in the 1800s. In the 1700s. It makes no sense today when you're trying to look at how modern technology works. And so, oftentimes, the question for Fourth Amendment analysis is, do police need a warrant? And that means, do they need a warrant to compel you to give over your data about yourself? But the Fourth Amendment warrant question, it never comes up when the police are just buying that data on the open market, right? So if police go to a data broker and simply say, I want the cell phone location data for every single person who is in San Diego on, the 17th, they can buy that. It's a, $10,000, $20,000 maybe, but they can buy that from any number of vendors. And when you're buying this information rather than using force to compel its disclosure, anytime you're purchasing on the open market, then you're effectively able to circumvent the Fourth Amendment debate. And now hopefully it will be struck down as illegal in the future, but it hasn't been so far.
Can I just add something? There might be people in the audience who need the missing, like a missing piece of information here is that, our cell phones here in our pockets are bleeding our location information out all the time without us knowing. Like if you have Google Maps turned on, if you have a period tracking app, like there's all kinds of things we install that are sending data about us out to these data brokers. And so that's how it's getting aggregated. So the folks Albert talks about can sell it.
Yeah, and these are the most sophisticated tracking devices that exist for the police. And if you have a free, oftentimes if you have a free app, you are the product. Your location is the product. This is incredibly valuable data for any number of advertisers. And so this allows them to do an end run. And I mentioned the Muslim prayer app where the US Air Force bought 90 million people's data. That's just one example we know. That's just one app. This could, and there's no reporting requirement for this. So when police are doing this, we have no idea. And so this is really something that is a really clear and present danger to all of us. Senator Ron Wyden has a bill that he's going to hopefully introduce soon that will address it. And in New York, we have a bill that will actually outlaw this, and we're hoping to be the first state in the country to ban this type of purchase of location data.
Just on the question of capturing cell phone data, particularly in protest settings, Albert, I wondered if you wanted to, you're certainly better placed than I am, just to talk about the Stingray technology, because it's not even necessary for the cops to get access to your physical phone in order to do that. And that's something that has been a particular impediment and, and burden to organizing
Yeah, exactly. So just a bit of history. So to access someone's phone under a case called Riley v. California, you actually do need a warrant in almost every case to crack open that person's phone. But when you're getting their location from the cell tower, from the apps, from any number of other third-party infrastructure developers, then you can circumvent that. Stingray ISMI catcher is a fake cell tower that sends out pings to all the nearby cell phones saying, connect to me, constantly, everyone nearby, connect to me. And because of that, the way our cell phones work, they're constantly looking for the closest tower, the strongest signal. And as a result, they are connecting to this tower and thinking, oh, this is the network. And so that means now they not only can track your location, they can potentially see all the data packets you're sending over that network and have a way to monitor the content of your communications. Often that second step requires a warrant, but of course, there's no real oversight most of the time for these warrant requirements, which is one of the many reasons we want to outlaw them.
So as promised, we're only a little bit over time, and I understand if people have to log off or need to go, but I did want us to leave with kind of getting advice from the panelists on what should people do now, right? You've listened to this amazing panelist, which, frankly, I'm really happy with all of you being able to join us in the conversation that came out. It's been informative to me, and I'm no longer cheering new laws that will incarcerate white people. What advice do you give to attendees who are watching? What organizations should they check out? What books should they read? Just any type of general advice that you would give to people who are now kind of concerned around surveillance and surveillance technologies. How will we save the world is what I'm asking you.
I can answer that, but can I first point to something that's happening that folks can do?
Please,
Yeah.
yes, all of that. Yeah.
Right. So that bill that I talked about that's happening in California, I think it's SB 764 around domestic terrorism and creating this what is it called, this task force that will, like Lily said, it's like creating another level of infrastructure that will always be there, right? And that's why we're concerned about it. That's going to be being introduced in public safety at the state, probably in the next week or two. So I want to urge folks to, call in and oppose that. I think that there hasn't been enough done, in California to really talk about why those things, why that bill is problematic. It's being introduced by a Democrat, and that's the interesting thing about this whole conversation around domestic terrorism is, it's not your traditional folks or folks you'd expect that are taking this on, right? And there might be good intention behind it, but I don't think that our lawmakers understand the complexity of it. So I'm going to urge folks to, reach out to your state legislators and talk about why this is problematic and why we should, we should think more nuanced about these things. And there's a lot of great organizations, the Trust Coalition here in San Diego, there's a whole bunch of organizations on it. In the steering committee, there's Tech Worker Coalition, Pillars of the Community, PANA, Tech Lead, MOGO, organizations, y'all can plug in. There's a lot of great work that needs to be done. In Chula Vista also, there's a coalition that's, I think it's called Stop Chula Vista now. So there's a lot of important work happening right here. So please plug in where it makes sense for you.
So I guess I would say two things to close it out. First, Hamaira, thank you for the kind words earlier. I appreciate that, but I think the truth is that I've been helped along the way because people who are more directly affected by these things than I am have come to me with their stories and their tips and their suggestions. So please continue to do that, because I think that the only way we're going to actually shed a light on these pervasive forms of technology is by doing it together. So it helps to collaborate and stay in the loop with one another. So reach out anytime, and I'll drop my email in the section here for people who want to. But then the other thing I would say for those of you who live in San Diego, I would pay special attention to the budget deliberations which are going to come up in a couple of months, because there's already a suggestion. There's already a push I've heard. I don't know how serious this is going to be, but there's a push to actually hire someone who would work on domestic terrorism at the city level, potentially within the Office of Race and Equity. So keep an ear out for that. And also for, there's more detail. I'm blanking on the other details, but yeah, it's all going to come up during the budget discussions in a couple of months. So yeah, keep your eyes out for that.
And just, I mean, I don't have too much in the way of concrete prescriptions, because I think it really is a question of your particular relationship to the surveillance state that informs how you how you should respond to it. And so I second all the things that Hamaira just said. I mean, one thing though that I would say in closing is just for folks to really internalize the urgency of this. I mean, I think about the and I keep coming back to this because it really was the point of departure for me on my surveillance work. In the surveillance of the Muslim American community in the tri-state area, it was about 10 years after that program had been rolled out before folks really got to an understanding of the scale of it and the particular way that it was being rolled out and used. And that again was through courageous reporting. So props and thanks to Jesse as well. But usually, it's the challenges that we're fighting in surveillance, there's a real lag. By the time we've sort of internalized the risk and we're getting organized and doing something about it, it's probably the case that we've been living with that surveillance for a very long time indeed already. And so I would just encourage folks to get mobilized around this and be and be active in all the ways that your local organizers are asking you to, like really pay attention to this stuff. And again, if CCR can help through the Open Records Project and helping you get sort of trained up on how to do FOIA or state records requests on your own, I'm happy to do that and to support in any other way we can.
So I know this all feels like a lot, right? We've been talking about all the ways that the state has all this power, the companies that fuel it, all of the things that have transformed our communities, and it can feel like so much. But we were talking earlier about wiretaps. For nearly half a century, there's no protection against wiretaps. It used to be that the police basically had free reign to put wiretaps wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. But people pushed back, and eventually they put in a lot of restrictions. And it's not perfect, but it went from being something that the police could do whenever they wanted to something they could very rarely do. And yeah, there's a lot of surveillance that's been built up, but we can dismantle this. We actually have the power to tear down these systems. But I think it's so crucial to do this at the local level. So I like to say stay vocal, but stay local, because you can have hundreds of thousands of people engaging on a policy debate in DC, millions of dollars being spent, and it doesn't even move the needle. But just a handful of committed people at City Hall can fundamentally remake the agenda. And your voice carries so much weight, not just in your local community, but in redefining the norms of communities all across the country, because that's how we're winning this, by city banning facial recognition, city by city passing these oversight ordinances, city by city really dismantling these technologies. And I think really just to the extent you can show up to the city council meetings, to the extent you can testify, to the extent you can amplify, that really will have a tremendous impact for the years to come. Because if we don't fight this now and we let it become a permanent fixture of our country, there won't be a going back. But we still have time to push in the other direction. In terms of other readings that people can do, I want to plug two great books, Simone Brown's Dark Matters and Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology. Clearly we have a virtual book club going on, and we didn't even know it. Those are both fantastic resources. And then for those of you who would like to connect with my organization, STOP, I'll include our website, and we're always looking to do whatever we can to work to support those of you who are on the ground fighting for this in your local communities.
And Lily.
Yeah, so I just wanted to acknowledge and thank Abhishek, who's in the chat, who raised the question of how US imperialism fits into this discussion. They both brought up the fact that US and Israeli tech companies are proliferating these surveillance technologies, and also the US developed a lot of these technologies surveilling other countries, which is actually, Jesse mentioned this when he talked about the role of kind of the internet as an early counterinsurgency technology. Palantir is a piece of software that we referred to that is essential to bringing together many, many kinds of these data sources we've been talking about, and they're used, Palantir fuses the data for fusion centers for law enforcement agencies. So Palantir was developed first and funded by the CIA for surveillance abroad. But also, Stop LAPD Spying has sort of pointed out in Los Angeles the ways that predictive policing and Palantir, this kind of surveillance for law enforcement, gets used to protect the value of property, to clear people away from places where condos are being developed. And so when I want to say that it's not just that imperialism develops this tech and then brings it home, but that I think one of the things our panelists have been telling us since the beginning is that those who disrupt the racialized order of how economic capitalist accumulation are the ones who get labeled as criminals and terrorists. And so in that sense, if we're seeing the techniques of imperialism also becoming the techniques used for domestic terrorism, it's because they're being used for the same purpose if we kind of look at this at a global scale. But there's a lot more to understand and talk about to figure out how to respond to this as kind of movements and communities. So if anybody wants to organize other community forums or discussion groups, please get in touch. A year ago, I was somebody who would never help put on a community forum. And so we need a lot of hands on deck. So please reach out.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists and to everybody who tuned in. I mean, the last thing I'll say is just organize. In Chula Vista, if your elected officials aren't responsive to you, replace them. We have to hold our elected officials accountable. Hamaira mentioned that the only district attorney who is championing this bill that she talked about is our district attorney in San Diego, Summer Steffens. When we see elected officials acting against the will or acting in a harmful way against the people, we just have to hold them accountable. And having talks like these where people become informed on the issues so that it's easier to do that, it's important. So have forums, read books, share the information as much as you can, talk with other people. If you see something that concerns you, do something about it. Corporations and governments are spending millions and if not billions of dollars in spreading this technology. And they're not only doing it on a national level, they're doing it locally, they're doing it nationally, and they're doing it on a world scale. And so if we don't organize globally, if we don't organize nationally, if we don't organize locally, there's no way that we'll be able to fight back. But we believe strongly in all of our coalition that has put this together, in the power of the people, which I think a lot of our to. We have to, challenge the power of money, challenge the power of government, challenge state power with the power of the people, because at the end of the day, they are supposed to be serving us. So again, thank you all so much. Thank you everybody who joined us, and hopefully this is a conversation that we'll continue to have. And that's it. Enjoy your dinner, folks. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Peace.
Bye.
Bye.